And you've been pretty active so far today on Twitter with the hashtag BBC The Briefing. Thank you for all your comments. We'll mention some later on. Also, though, we're talking about the latest numbers from Snapchat. Shares in the social media platform plunging some 20% in after-hours trade on Wall Street. Basically, it said its losses were more than $400 million in one quarter. Also, it had lower than expected revenue growth. User growth was down and the outlook is not much better. Well, Ollie Cornock is with us again, Editor-in-Chief at Oxford Business Group. Ollie, Snapchat really struggling, but as one of the analysts I spoke to earlier was saying, when you've got Facebook at war with you, it's not going to be easy, is it?
Absolutely not. And of course, Facebook and to another extent, Google are the champions of online advertising. And the ubiquity of these social media apps means that if you fall foul of one of the big boys, you're gonna be challenged, and that's exactly what seems to have happened. I think the other element to this story is you've got to change and remain dynamic. We've seen Twitter changing its platform today to doubling the characters in use. Snapchat is struggling to change its user interface, as I understand it. I'm not a Snapchat user. But I think the functionality, the usability is paramount. So those two things, advertising and functionality. I must admit, I'm not a Snapchat user either, although some of my children are. I do confess to that much. And when I think about the user base of Snapchat, then I wonder how easy they are to advertise, you know, to grab in terms of advertising revenues, that kind of thing. What the audience is like in terms of getting advertisers to come on board and spend their money, where at the moment, as you say, they're busy advertising on Facebook and Google. It's a very interesting angle because, of course, Snapchat is aimed at quite a young demographic, whereas Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, which is sort of almost universal. But it's really interesting, I think, that they have to try and meet that market. They meet that market demand. Advertisers have to change as well, remember, and I think everyone's playing catch-up. This is a very fast-paced world, isn't it, social media? It is, absolutely. Ollie, thank you very much. Ollie is back for the news. Now, what else is making the news across the media today? Let's start with the New York Times, and it looks, of course, at the US President's latest stop in his Asia tour, China. The paper saying the visit will give the Chinese government the opportunity to cast itself as equal to America in terms of global standing. BBC Online and other outlets looks at the war-torn Yemen, where aid agencies are seeking urgent access for humanitarian supplies after the current Saudi Arabia-led coalition closed all routes into the country. The Telegraph talks about the situation in the cabinet. British MP Priti Patel's future is hanging in the balance after it emerged she held 2 unauthorised meetings with senior Israeli politicians without telling Downing Street. Financial Times carries a warning from Wall Street banks. Slow progress in Brexit may force them to move thousands of jobs away from the City of London. And finally, on the Wired website, it looks at Google's self-driving car company Waymo, now running its autonomous minivans around Phoenix, Arizona, with no human inside to grab the wheel if things go bad. Within a couple of months, you could climb aboard the world's first driverless ride-hailing service if you're there in Arizona. Would you revel with that thought or not? Would you never get in one? I'm joined by Oliver Cornock, Editor-in-Chief of Oxford Business Group. I promised he would return, and he's here. Ollie, welcome back to the studio. So let's start with the New York Times. Of course, it has its own agenda when it comes to coverage of President Trump. We know its angle, as it were. It talks about its visit to China. Give us your take on that. I think it's a very interesting story. It talks of the idea that China is on some sort of parity with the US, and of course, by a lot of economic measures, by 2030, the economy will be bigger than the US economy. So there is that sort of serious background to this. Then there's a certain irony, isn't there, that this sort of Communist Party princeling, just re-elected as head of the Communist Party, and this wheeler dealer, this brash wheeler dealer that the New York Times loves to poke fun at, meeting together and getting a message out there. And of course, on the one hand, Donald Trump has been very critical of some of Chinese business practice, particularly when it comes to trade. And then on the other, he's got to engage with China, hasn't he? Particularly over this thorny issue of North Korea and the nuclear question. And it's quite interesting because, of course, President Xi went to the US, didn't he? Very glamorous at President Trump's residence in Florida. And since then,
changed a lot between the two countries, and also for the two presidents. I mean, President Trump is having a very tough time at home, getting very little through in terms of his own key changes and policy measures, and yet President Xi, his status, his power has been elevated to that of Chairman Mao.
Absolutely, and it's a fascinating situation, isn't it? Particularly as it contrasts so wonderfully this sort of wonderfully mercurial figure of Donald Trump and the very steady, sort of almost waxen image of Chinese modern, you know, third-way communism, really.
We shall watch with great interest, that's for sure, over the next, well, he's arriving in a few hours, but over the next few days while he's in China. Now, this we've put in specifically, Ollie, because you're here, you're a specialist in the area of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. The BBC looking at the conflict and the likes of the UN and the Red Cross saying it's a catastrophic situation with millions who need life-saving aid. The UN Security Council will discuss this today. I mean, it is absolutely horrendous.
It is, and we've seen huge levels of cholera, we've seen huge levels of mortality, huge numbers of death, and we shouldn't use the word mortality. These are deaths. These are the result of this ongoing conflict that sort of just bubbles along like a weeping sore at the end of the Arabian Peninsula. And you say, you know, for those of us who watched this region, it's been a very dramatic few days. And what's happened in the run-up to this blockade on Yemen has been monumental. But focusing particularly on Yemen just for a moment, this doesn't show any signs of going away, and it will be very interesting to see the UN's response. Actually, I mean, we've had some criticism from the UN that seems to support the Saudi accusation that Iran is supplying weapons to the rebels. And as we know, over the weekend, a weapon was allegedly fired at Riyadh, which was then shot out of the sky by the Saudi Defence Forces, which has then predicated this blockade. The humanitarian angle, though, regardless of the politics, is grim.
But it's the politics that is preventing any sort of forward thinking as far as Yemen is concerned, isn't it? When you look at sort of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi purge, you've got Donald Trump on Air Force One saying, hey, we want to see Aramco listing in New York. You've got the UK trying to get as much business out of Saudi Arabia as possible. You know, the focus on Saudi Arabia's side in this story is, you know, from an international perspective, is more about what they can get out of Saudi Arabia, isn't it, as opposed to putting pressure on Saudi Arabia.
And you can't help thinking that we're living in this era of realpolitik, which is pretty hardline. You know, you have to do business with certain people, it's argued, and you'll have to put up with certain elements that you might not like about their policy making.
Now, let's have a look at the internal politics in the UK and another challenge for Prime Minister Theresa May. She's already lost one cabinet minister in just the last week. It looks like Priti Patel. Some might say she has to go as well.
Well, I mean, in a sense, many of the papers, and remember, the Daily Telegraph, for our international viewers, is actually very much supporting the Conservative Party. So this is quite an interesting angle. I mean, it asks, how much does a minister have to do to get the sack? This is quite interesting. I mean, this is somebody who has contravened all the sort of standards of ministerial conduct, yet she's at the moment got away with it. Talking about the disputed Golan Heights on a private trip will be sending alarm bells across the intelligence community, the government and everybody else.
Now let's look at Financial Times. Wall Street banks warning Trump team over rising fears of Brexit chaos. What do you make of this story? I mean, every day we have a Brexit warning, a Brexit fear story out there. Your thoughts?
Well, interestingly, I've just got back from talking to some Mexicans who would argue exactly the same about NAFTA and the uncertainty that the US is putting out there. So I think we have to balance this out. I think there's a sort of pots and kettles. But undoubtedly, if you were a big bank headquartered in London for your European business, you'll be very concerned about passporting rights. You'll be very concerned about the post-Brexit deal. And a year into negotiations, and we haven't really had much. Now, all I would say is this comes at bad timing for Theresa May, who is embattled, as we've seen in our previous story. At the same time, if you're a banker, the opposition and Jeremy Corbyn, who espouses some sort of Venezuela-style socialism for the UK, will perhaps give even bigger cause for alarm for banks.
Now, talking of causes for alarm, are you alarmed about the thought of getting in a taxi without a human in it, a driverless taxi? This is what Waymo is testing now in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, where they're actually on the streets. There's going to be these driverless taxis.
Well, apparently Google have been doing this for 7 years, and they really have stolen a march on the big majors like Audi, apparently. I quite like the idea, I have to say.
It doesn't worry you? There isn't a human there to take the wheel if things go wrong?
Of course it worries me, but as a kind of somebody who has to embrace change, I'm not, I recognise that I've got a sort of Luddite in me that I have to counter. One interesting business angle, how do you insure a driverless car?
Well, this was actually in the press only a couple of days ago. We were talking about this. In the UK, they're looking at the whole insurance, side of the business when it comes to driverless vehicles, because that's a huge
Absolutely.
issue.
Is it?
It's not just insurance. It's the whole issue of everything, infrastructure, the whole story.
So I think whilst this is the future, there's an awful lot of infrastructure around it at every angle that's going to need to be put in place for this to become a reality.
All right. Now, I just want to we talked about Snapchat and Twitter earlier. We have had so many tweets from viewers who have been getting in touch with us. I just want to share some of them with you. So John says, I'm a Twitter LinkedIn user, but not with the others. It's because 2 is enough for me. We've got Jamie saying the users on Snapchat are not a small feat. The issue is that Snapchat has not really compromised their user experience. I am sure that soon they'll be adding on services that will help them monetize. Give us your take on this issue of social media, Ollie, and all the ones that are out there, LinkedIn's, Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, etc., etc. Which ones are the most user-friendly for you? Which ones are the most useful? For
me, I use Twitter a lot because I follow news, probably like you. I keep Facebook for sort of personal use. I look at Instagram for personal use, and LinkedIn for business use. But it comes down to functionality, doesn't it? It comes down to what you use. One of the criticisms of Snapchat is this user interface. It's obviously not as smooth as it could be, and if it's appealing to young people, presumably a lot of people in the developing world, bottom-heavy populations,
the other issue as well is as my previous guest was saying, Facebook's gone to war with Snapchat, and this is the real worry, that these smaller companies eventually will not be able to compete with the likes of Facebook that is monopolising the market at the end of the day.
And it's a David and Goliath scenario, and if you fall on the wrong side of Facebook, then woe betide you.
Ollie, as ever, it's been great to have you with us. Ollie Connock from Oxford Business Group. Let's just mention a couple more. We've got Jamie. Jamie, you're watching us in Delhi. Thanks for your tweet. It's difficult for some platforms, says Jamie. Snapchat has to add on services that help users live better. And we've got Greg in Namibia. I've mentioned you already. He's saying he's a big fan of Facebook and Twitter as well. Thanks so much for all your comments today on The Briefing. We've, of course, got all the latest business news and sport coming up at the top of the hour. But from me, for now, it's goodbye. I'll see you soon.